It didn't take long, but the other day I received my "What are your 10 most valuable records?" email. I have no idea what my 10 most valuable records are. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you on a step-by-step process through my collection a little bit at a time. And I promise you I'm going to show you some amazing records because no one demanded it, my not top 10 most valuable, but at least 5 of my favorite records whose labels begin with the letter A. Hello, and welcome to the 78 RPM channel. Whether you're new to 78s or an advanced collector, this is your source for information, research, and music about 78 RPM records, cylinders, and radio transcriptions. Hey gang, and welcome to the studio. This is where I do digital transfers of 78 RPM records, of radio transcriptions, film production discs, and things like that. As I mentioned, I have no idea what the most valuable records in my collection are, but I've got some fun stuff, and I thought the best way to do this is to start at the beginning and we'll slowly drift our way to the end. This is a good opportunity to point out, I think it's very important to have a good filing system for your records if you're going to have more than, say, 50 records in your collection. I personally sort them by label and then by catalog number. This gives you a structure that when you acquire new records, you can file them in. Today we're going to look at records whose labels begin with the letter A. And that means, as I mentioned, the first record in my collection, alphabetically catalog-wise, is this ARC Paramount by Lale and Cab Calloway. This is a fairly late 78, especially for my collection. This was recorded in 1956, and the two reasons I keep it are, number one, if you happen to be the father of a little girl, you probably don't want to listen to this without a hanky or two on hand. That's not to say it's overly schlocky. It's a really, really good record. In addition, this is the last 78 by Cab Calloway that was issued in the United States. I believe he had one more that was issued only in Canada. Lale Calloway, who was his daughter, was only 8 years old when this was made, and again, it's a little bit sweet, but I think it's pretty cool to see how Cab Calloway went from one end of the spectrum all the way to this before he stopped making 78s.
Tell me why, Daddy dear, are the tears in your eyes?
Little one, yes, the world's really round, and the blue birds you search for will surely be found. And the sky up above is so blue and clear, so that you see the blue bird if it should come near.
This record is easily locatable online, and if you actually want a copy of the 78, there's no significant value to this record. You can probably pick one of these up for under $10 without a lot of difficulty. At the opposite end of the spectrum is this beauty. You cannot pick this one up without difficulty. This is on the Ajax label. Ajax records were mostly recorded in Chicago, but they were released in Canada. And this one is a beaut. This is the Texas Blues Destroyers doing Lenox Avenue Shuffle, and then Down in the Mouth Blues is on the flip side. There's a really cool story behind this, because the Texas Blues Destroyers, which consisted of two guys, Bubber Miley is the trumpet player, and then there was a guy playing what sounds like a toy reed organ, like one of the little portable organs that you would give to kids. And those two went into the studio here at Ajax in Chicago, and they recorded these two sides. 3 days later, they made their way to the Paramount recording studios, where they recorded the same two sides. Then 2 days later, they went to Vocalion and recorded the same two sides. Interestingly enough, all three labels released both sides. And so within a matter of weeks, Ajax, Paramount, and what was the other one? Vocalion, all released these two sides. They were the only two sides that the Texas Blues Destroyers ever did. Just to be clear, if you have a Texas Blues Destroyer record on any of those three labels, they are all tough to find. They all have some value to them. So hang on to it. Actually, better than that, listen to it, because it's really interesting to hear the little toy reed organ countered with Bubber Miley's trumpet. It's a kind of a really, really odd record in a way. Record number 3 from the A's is on the Ampersand label. You may not have ever heard of that. These were released in Australia, and this is a Graham Bell record. He's doing Singin' the Blues. Now, you might think that the other side, Strut Miss Lizzie, would be the cooler side, but it's actually, in my opinion, not. Graham Bell was part of the Dixieland revival that occurred in the Australian jazz scene in the 40s and 50s, and I just am not a big fan of Dixieland jazz. The other side, Strut Miss Lizzie, really Dixieland. This side is not. This side has some really good jazz to it, and it's very enjoyable even if you don't like Dixieland. And so the fact that it's on the Ampersand label, and in addition, it's actually on dark red vinyl. So it's a fun record, and I thought it'd be something you probably haven't seen, so you know what, I thought I'd share it. Record number 4 out of 5 is on the Ajax label. And this is actually another post-war label. I'm breaking my own rules here. This is the voices of Dorothy Collins doing Mountain High, Valley Low. And the reason it's called the voices of Dorothy Collins is that this is a self-quartet. Dorothy Collins sings all 4 parts on this record. She sings extremely high soprano, and she also sings bass baritone. And if you're wondering how she did that, well, first of all, you have to understand that to sing a quartet with yourself, it has to be overdubbed. You have to record one part, then while the other part is there, you have to go back and record over that, and record over that, and record over that, and you get the idea. When Dorothy had to sing bass baritone, what they did, and what the studio geniuses did, was they recorded her in her normal register, but singing at double speed. That is the parrot, and he likes to be part of these videos. Just let him do his thing. Once they had Dorothy singing at double speed but in her normal octave, they simply cut the speed of the recording by half, thus meaning she is singing at the correct pace, but she is now singing an octave lower. They did the same thing with her singing high soprano. Well, I guess they did the opposite thing, singing high soprano, and that way she could sing all 4 parts. What you get is something that's almost creepy, a very eerie and creepy ethereal sound with the voices of Dorothy Collins.
Mountain high, go in search of new moons. Dreams will bridge the skies to you. If you need me, I will be nearby. Lantern gay, willow sad, valley low, mountain high.
The last record I'm going to show you is more along the lines of what you normally see in a best of video. This record is rare, this record is valuable, this record is old pre-war stuff. This is the Super Syncopators on the Autograph label. For those of you familiar with 78 Quarterly Magazine, you are aware that they published what they thought were the rarest 78s that existed, and they came up with rough guesstimates as to how many copies of certain records existed by polling the most advanced collectors in the world. This is one of the records that appears on the 78 Quarterly list, and this record, according to 78 Quarterly issue number 10, which I believe was published in the early, maybe mid-1990s, 2 copies of this record exist according to 78 Quarterly Magazine. Their guesstimates are sometimes a little bit on the low side. However, there are 2 things that indicate that whether 2 copies is accurate or not, this is an extremely rare disc. Number one is that when 78 Quarterly says something is rare, there may be more copies than they are estimating, but that doesn't mean it's common. You're not going to see a record like this. Oh, 78 Quarterly says there are 2 copies. All of a sudden we look around and there are 9 copies on eBay. That does not happen. The second thing is, there was a book published last year by Richard Rachelson, which documented the history of the autograph label. He queried archives and collectors all over the world to see who had copies of what. And when his survey of collectors, archives, libraries, museums was done, guess how many copies he found? 2. Possibly the same 2. Now, I do not believe this copy is one of the 2 that he identified. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that there are actually at least 3 copies of this record that exist in the world. That's still pretty rare. And the other side, pretty cool as well, When My Sugar Walks Down the Street. But the reason I acquired this record, and to be fair, I did not junk this record. I acquired this one in a record auction. The reason that I acquired this one is because the Super Syncopators only did 2 records, both of them appearing on autograph, both of them extremely rare. I believe the other record, an estimate of that would probably put it in the neighborhood of 7 copies of that record exist worldwide. I had to get this one because I had the other one and I wanted them both. The reason I showed you this one is because apparently this one's a little bit rare. It's pretty cool to have a record that 78 Quarterly says 2 copies exist in the entire world. Before we go, here's a copy of Richard Rachelson's book, which has that information in it. If you want a copy, it was just published last year, so they are available online. I believe you can order it from 78rpm.com. If not, you can probably get it from Amazon. I do not receive 1 red cent for that free advertisement. But if you are interested in such things, this is a great book, a big chunk of book, extremely well documented. There are color illustrations. It's just really well done. And so if you have any records that are on the Marsh autograph label, be sure to pick up a copy of that book. Like all books, it's ridiculously and grossly expensive, but the paperback's a little bit cheaper. Finally, I referenced 78 Quarterly magazine, and here is the issue of 78 Quarterly magazine from which that information came. 78 Quarterly is cool because it lists what advanced collectors feel were the rarest records in the world, and generally they're right. They also give an estimate as to how many of each of those records exist. So if you see copies of 78 Quarterly magazine and they're not ridiculously expensive, I mean, I've seen them go for over $100 before, but you can usually get a copy pretty easily for under $20. There are 12. There were 12 issues in the entire run. The first 2 issues are pretty scarce. Slightly less scarce is a reprint of the first 2 issues. And then once you get to issue 3 through 12, you can find those online. That's going to wrap up the A section of my collection. Obviously, next up will be the letter B. That means Bluebird, Broadway, Brunswick. Those 3 right there will probably cover the ones that I show you in the video. I bet I have a Bluebird record you have never seen. We'll take a look at it next time. In the meantime, thanks for watching us here on the 78 RPM channel.